The Winter War, 1939–1940. Welcome. Tonight we are going to talk about the Winter War, a conflict that unfolded in the frozen forests and snowbound landscapes of Finland during the dark winter months of 1939 and 1940. This was a war that captured the imagination of the world, a struggle between a small Nordic nation and the massive Soviet Union. A David and Goliath story set against a backdrop of pristine snow, ancient forests, and temperatures that plunged far below zero. It was a conflict that would demonstrate the power of courage, determination, and intimate knowledge of terrain, while also revealing the terrible costs of war even in victory. As we settle in this evening, let us journey back to that bitter winter, to understand how this war came about, how it was fought, and what it meant for Finland, for Europe, and for the broader conflict that was just beginning to engulf the world. This is a story of extraordinary bravery and sacrifice, of military innovation and adaptation, of a nation's will to survive against overwhelming odds. It is a story that unfolds in the eerie beauty of the Nordic winter, where the short days and long nights created a surreal and haunting atmosphere for one of the most remarkable military campaigns of the 20th century. The road to war. To understand the Winter War, we must first understand the world from which it emerged, and the long history that brought Finland and the Soviet Union to the brink of conflict. Finland's relationship with Russia had been complex and often difficult, stretching back centuries into the mists of Northern European history. For much of its early history, Finland had been part of the Swedish realm, a collection of provinces on the eastern edge of the Swedish kingdom. The Finnish people had their own distinct language and culture, part of the Finno-Ugric family rather than the Germanic or Slavic groups that surrounded them. But politically, they were subjects of the Swedish crown, and Swedish was the language of administration and the upper classes. This changed in 1809, when Sweden, defeated in yet another war with Russia, was forced to cede Finland to the Russian Empire. The Russians, however, did not simply absorb Finland, as they had absorbed so many other territories. Instead, Tsar Alexander I established Finland as a Grand Duchy, an autonomous entity within the Russian Empire, with its own government, legal system, and eventually its own currency. For much of the 19th century, this arrangement worked reasonably well. The Finns enjoyed considerable autonomy, and a distinct Finnish national identity began to flourish. However, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Russian policy toward Finland became increasingly oppressive. A program of Russification was implemented, attempting to reduce Finnish autonomy and integrate the Grand Duchy more fully into the Russian Empire. The Finnish language was suppressed. Russian became mandatory in schools, and government and Finnish political institutions were weakened. This policy created deep resentment among Finns and strengthened Finnish nationalism. The collapse of the Russian Empire in 1917 gave Finland its opportunity for independence. As Russia descended into revolution and civil war, the Finnish parliament declared independence on December 6, 1917. The Bolshevik government, preoccupied with its own survival, recognized Finnish independence in early 1918. However, Finland immediately plunged into its own civil war between pro-Soviet socialists and nationalist forces backed by Germany. The nationalists, known as the Whites, won this brief but bloody conflict, and Finland emerged as an independent republic, though one deeply scarred by civil war and wary of its massive neighbor to the east. The 1920s and 1930s saw Finland establish itself as a stable, democratic nation. The country adopted a republican constitution, held regular elections, and built a prosperous economy based on forestry agriculture, and emerging industries. Finnish culture flourished, and the nation took pride in its achievements. The great Finnish composer Jean Sibelius became a symbol of Finnish identity, his music evoking the forests, lakes, and spirit of the nation. Finnish athletes competed in international competitions, most famously the long-distance runner Paavo Nurmi, whose victories brought prestige to the young nation. But Finland's security situation remained precarious. The country was small, with a population of less than 4 million, while the Soviet Union had a population of nearly 200 million. Moreover, Finland's longest border was with the Soviet Union, over 1,000 kilometers of frontier running through forests, lakes, and tundra. The Finnish city of Viipuri was only 32 kilometers from the Soviet border, and Leningrad, the Soviet Union's second-largest city, was only the same short distance from Finnish territory. From the Soviet perspective, Finland represented a potential security threat. The proximity of hostile territory to Leningrad was troubling, particularly as tensions in Europe grew during the 1930s. Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, ever paranoid about threats to his regime, viewed Finland through the lens of security and strategic advantage. He remembered that during the Russian Civil War, British forces had operated from Finnish territory, and he feared that in any future conflict, Finland might serve as a corridor for an attack on Leningrad or a base for hostile powers. The geopolitical situation in Europe was transformed in the late 1930s by the rise of Nazi Germany. Adolf Hitler's aggressive foreign policy, which had already seen Germany reoccupy the Rhineland, annex Austria, and dismember Czechoslovakia, seemed to be leading inevitably toward a major European war. The Soviet Union, ideologically opposed to Nazi Germany, but acutely aware of its own military weaknesses after Stalin's purges of the officer corps, sought to buy time and secure its borders. This led to one of the most cynical diplomatic agreements of the 20th century, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, signed on August 23, 1939. Publicly, this was a non-aggression treaty between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. But the pact included a secret protocol that divided Eastern Europe into German and Soviet spheres of influence. Finland was assigned to the Soviet sphere, along with the Baltic states and eastern Poland. When Germany invaded Poland on September 1, 1939, beginning World War II in Europe, the Soviet Union invaded from the east 2 weeks later, claiming its share under the secret protocol. Poland was crushed between the two totalitarian powers. The Soviet Union then turned its attention to the other territories in its sphere of influence. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, were quickly coerced into accepting Soviet military bases on their territory and signing mutual assistance pacts that effectively ended their independence. By the summer of 1940, they would be fully annexed by the Soviet Union. Finland, however, would prove more resistant. In October 1939, the Soviet Union invited Finnish representatives to Moscow for negotiations. The Soviet proposals, presented by Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov, were extensive. The Soviets demanded that Finland cede several territories to the Soviet Union, including the entire Karelian Isthmus, the land bridge between the Gulf of Finland and Lake Ladoga, where Viipuri was located, several islands in the Gulf of Finland, and a naval base on the Hanko Peninsula. In exchange, the Soviets offered a larger but less developed area of eastern Karelia. The Soviet justification for these demands was security. Stalin argued that Leningrad needed to be protected, that the Soviet Union needed strategic depth on its northwestern frontier. He pointed out that hostile artillery on the Karelian Isthmus could shell Leningrad. A naval base at Hanko would help the Soviet Union control the Gulf of Finland. These were, from the Soviet perspective, reasonable security measures given the deteriorating international situation. But from the Finnish perspective, the demands were unacceptable. The territories the Soviets wanted included some of Finland's most productive agricultural and industrial areas. Viipuri was Finland's second-largest city. The Karelian Isthmus was home to hundreds of thousands of Finns. Allowing a Soviet naval base on Finnish territory would compromise Finnish sovereignty and make Finland vulnerable to further Soviet pressure. Moreover, the Finns had no reason to trust Soviet promises. They had seen what had happened to the Baltic states, coerced step by step into accepting Soviet control. The Finnish government, led by President Kyösti Kallio and Foreign Minister Eljas Erkko, attempted to negotiate, offering some limited concessions, but refusing to accept the full Soviet demands. The negotiations dragged on through October and into November. The Finnish position was complicated by the fact that public opinion was strongly opposed to any concessions to the Soviet Union. The memory of Finland's recent independence, the pride in what the nation had achieved, the fear of Soviet intentions, all of these made compromise politically difficult. The Soviets grew increasingly impatient. Stalin reportedly said to his military commanders, "We'll have to start a war." But the Soviet leadership, like many observers, vastly underestimated Finland. They believed that the Finnish government was controlled by a small elite that oppressed the Finnish workers and peasants. They expected that when the Red Army crossed the border, the Finnish working class would rise up and welcome their Soviet liberators. They calculated that the war would be over in a matter of weeks, perhaps even days. This fundamental misunderstanding of Finnish society and the Finnish will to resist would prove to be a catastrophic error in Soviet planning. The shelling of Manila and the outbreak of war. As November 1939 wore on, with negotiations at an impasse, tensions along the Finnish-Soviet border grew acute. Both sides reinforced their frontier positions. The atmosphere was thick with suspicion and fear. It seemed that some incident, some spark, would ignite the powder keg. That spark came on November 26, 1939, in the village of Manila on the Karelian Isthmus. According to Soviet reports, Finnish artillery fired across the border, killing 4 Soviet soldiers and wounding 9. The Soviet government immediately protested this provocation and demanded that Finland pull its troops back 20 to 25 kilometers from the border. The Finnish government denied that any such shelling had occurred from the Finnish side and suggested an impartial investigation. To this day, the truth of the Manila incident remains disputed, though most historians believe it was a false flag operation staged by the Soviets to provide a pretext for war. The Finns noted that they had very few artillery pieces in the area and that Soviet casualties from artillery fire would have been much higher had there actually been a barrage. Moreover, the Soviet response, immediately breaking off diplomatic relations and launching a full-scale invasion within days, suggests that the attack was the pretext the Soviets had been seeking. On November 28th, the Soviet Union unilaterally abrogated its non-aggression pact with Finland. 2 days later, on November 30th, 1939, without a declaration of war, Soviet forces attacked Finland across the entire length of the border. The scale of the Soviet attack was overwhelming. The Red Army committed approximately 450,000 troops to the initial invasion, organized into 4 armies. The main thrust came across the Karelian Isthmus, where the Soviet 7th Army, numbering over 200,000 men, advanced toward Viipuri and the Finnish defensive line. In central Finland, the Soviet 8th Army attacked through difficult, forested terrain. In the north, two more armies invaded through Finnish Lapland, with the ultimate goal of cutting Finland in two and capturing the northern port cities. The Soviet forces were supported by thousands of artillery pieces, over 1,000 tanks, and hundreds of aircraft. The Red Army had overwhelming superiority in every category of military equipment. On paper, the coming conflict looked like it would be a brief, one-sided affair. The Finnish forces, by contrast, were vastly outnumbered and outgunned. Finland could mobilize approximately 300,000 men, but many of these troops were poorly equipped and inadequately trained. Finland had virtually no tanks, only a few dozen modern artillery pieces, and an air force of fewer than 150 aircraft, most of them obsolete. The Finnish army relied heavily on reservists, men who had completed their compulsory military service, but who had not been soldiers for years. Yet Finland had certain advantages that would prove crucial in the coming conflict. The Finns were fighting on their home territory, in terrain and climate they understood intimately. The Finnish soldiers were accustomed to the harsh winter conditions, skilled at skiing and moving through snow-covered forests. They were defending their homeland, their families, their very right to exist as an independent nation. And they were led by competent, experienced officers who understood both their own limitations and how to exploit Soviet weaknesses. The commander of the Finnish forces was Field Marshal Carl Gustaf Emil Mannerheim, one of the most remarkable military figures of the 20th century. Mannerheim was 72 years old when the Winter War began, but his age belied a sharp mind and vigorous spirit. He had been born into an aristocratic Swedish-speaking Finnish family in 1867, during the era when Finland was still a Grand Duchy of the Russian Empire. He had pursued a military career in the Imperial Russian Army, serving with distinction in the Russo-Japanese War and World War I, reaching the rank of lieutenant general. After the Russian Revolution, Mannerheim had returned to Finland and commanded the White Forces during the Finnish Civil War. In the interwar period, he had been a prominent political figure, serving as regent briefly and continuing to advocate for strong national defense. When war came in 1939, he was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Finnish Armed Forces, a position he would hold with distinction throughout the Winter War and beyond. Mannerheim understood that Finland could not defeat the Soviet Union in a conventional war of attrition. The disparity in resources was simply too great. Instead, Finland would have to fight a defensive war, using the terrain to their advantage, inflicting maximum casualties on the invaders while preserving their own forces, and holding out long enough for international intervention or for the Soviets to decide that the cost of conquering Finland was too high. The key to this strategy was the Mannerheim Line, a series of defensive fortifications across the Karelian Isthmus. This defensive line, constructed in the 1920s and 1930s, consisted of bunkers, anti-tank obstacles, trenches, and artillery positions stretching across the 65-kilometer-wide isthmus. It was not as formidable as propaganda on both sides sometimes portrayed it. Certainly not comparable to the French Maginot Line or German Siegfried Line. But it was a well-designed defensive position that took advantage of natural features like rivers, lakes, and forested terrain. As Soviet forces crossed the border on that cold November morning in 1939, they expected to sweep aside Finnish resistance quickly. They were in for a very unpleasant surprise. The first battles. The Soviet invasion began with massive artillery bombardments of Finnish positions and air raids on Finnish cities. On the very first day of the war, Soviet bombers struck Helsinki, killing civilians and destroying buildings. This attack on the Finnish capital, coming without warning or declaration of war, outraged world opinion and solidified Finnish resolve to resist. But the air raids, while terrifying and destructive, did not break Finnish morale as the Soviets had hoped. Instead, they strengthened Finnish determination to fight. The image of tiny Finland under attack by the Soviet colossus evoked sympathy around the world and became a powerful rallying cry for the Finnish people. On the ground, the initial Soviet attacks met with mixed results. On the Karelian Isthmus, the Soviet 7th Army advanced rapidly at first, pushing Finnish covering forces back toward the Mannerheim Line. The Finns conducted a fighting retreat, delaying the Soviet advance and destroying infrastructure as they went. Within 2 weeks, the Red Army had advanced to the Mannerheim Line, but this was where progress stopped. The Soviet forces, expecting light resistance, had not prepared for a serious siege. Their troops were not trained for winter warfare, despite coming from a northern country. Many Soviet soldiers were from southern regions of the USSR and had never experienced the kind of cold that Finland offered. They wore standard uniforms that provided inadequate protection against temperatures that often dropped to -30 degrees Celsius or lower. Their equipment froze, their vehicles stalled. Their supply lines, stretched across territory that the retreating Finns had thoroughly demolished, struggled to deliver food, ammunition, and medical supplies. The Finns, by contrast, were in their element. They wore warm, white winter uniforms that provided both protection from the cold and camouflage in the snow. They moved on skis, gliding through forests and across frozen lakes with an ease that seemed almost magical to the Soviet troops struggling through the deep snow on foot. They knew every path, every hill, every frozen stream in their homeland. The fighting along the Mannerheim line quickly settled into a pattern. Soviet forces would mass for an attack, announced by hours of artillery bombardment. Then waves of infantry, supported by tanks, would assault the Finnish positions. The Finns, fighting from prepared defenses and using their limited artillery with precision, would repel these attacks with heavy Soviet casualties. At night, Finnish ski patrols would infiltrate Soviet positions, attacking headquarters units, supply depots, and artillery positions before disappearing back into the dark forests. One weapon that became symbolic of Finnish resistance was the Molotov cocktail, a crude but effective anti-tank weapon consisting of a bottle filled with flammable liquid, with a rag stuffed in the top that was lit just before throwing. The name was a sarcastic reference to Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov, who had claimed that Soviet bombers were dropping food, not bombs, on Finnish cities. The Finns replied that if Molotov was sending food baskets, they would send cocktails to go with them. Finnish soldiers became adept at attacking Soviet tanks with these improvised weapons. They would wait in foxholes or behind rocks as Soviet tanks rumbled past, then jump up and throw the Molotov cocktails at the tank's engine compartments or tracks. It required extraordinary courage to get that close to a tank, but the Finns did it repeatedly, destroying Soviet armor and demoralizing Soviet crews. While the fighting on the Karelian Isthmus settled into a grinding battle of attrition, events in central and northern Finland took a dramatically different turn. Here, the Soviet 8th, 9th, and 14th armies were advancing through terrain that was completely unsuitable for conventional military operations. The forests of central Finland are vast and dense, broken up by thousands of lakes and marshes. The roads are few and poor. In winter, the snow is deep, the cold is extreme, and the hours of daylight are brief. This is not tank country. This is not even really truck country. The Soviet forces advancing through these regions soon found themselves strung out along the few roads, unable to maneuver, vulnerable to ambush. The Finnish forces in these regions were outnumbered and outgunned, but they used tactics that perfectly suited the terrain and conditions. They would allow Soviet columns to penetrate deep into Finnish territory, then cut the columns into segments, isolating units from each other and from their supply lines. These isolated segments, called moti, a Finnish word for a stack of firewood logs, would then be systematically destroyed. The moti tactics required patience, discipline, and intimate knowledge of the terrain. Small groups of Finnish ski troops would infiltrate through the forests, bypassing Soviet positions to attack from the rear. They would cut roads, destroy supply depots, eliminate headquarters units. The isolated Soviet units, surrounded in the frozen forest, would attempt to break out or wait for relief, but relief rarely came. The Finnish forces, though smaller, were more mobile and could move reinforcements quickly on skis. The Soviet forces, tied to the roads, were slow and predictable. The psychological effect of moti tactics on Soviet troops was devastating. Imagine being a Soviet soldier, far from home in a frozen forest, surrounded by an enemy you cannot see, slowly running out of food and ammunition, watching your comrades die from cold, hunger, and Finnish bullets. The forests seemed to be full of ghosts, white-clad Finnish soldiers who appeared suddenly, struck, and vanished. Soviet troops began to call the Finnish soldiers the White Death, a name that captured both their deadly effectiveness and their phantom-like quality. The battles of Suomussalmi and Rajatie Road. The most famous example of Finnish moti tactics occurred at Suomussalmi, a small village in central Finland, in December 1939 and January 1940. This battle would become legendary, a David versus Goliath story that seemed almost too dramatic to be true, yet it was documented and witnessed by military observers from several countries. In late November 1939, the Soviet 163rd Division, numbering about 14,000 men, advanced westward along the few roads through the wilderness north of Lake Ladoga, heading toward the town of Suomussalmi. The Soviet plan was to cut Finland in two, reaching the Swedish border and isolating northern Finland from the south. The 163rd Division made good progress initially, capturing Suomussalmi on December 7th. However, the division was now dangerously extended, with its units strung out along a narrow road through dense forest. The Finnish command recognized the opportunity. Colonel Hjalmar Sielasvuo, commanding Finnish forces in the region, was ordered to retake Suomussalmi and destroy the Soviet division. Sielasvuo had only about 6,000 men initially, many of them reservists and volunteers, but they were highly motivated and expertly trained in winter warfare. Over several days in mid-December, Finnish forces systematically cut the Soviet division into smaller moti, isolating companies and battalions from each other. The Finns attacked the isolated units relentlessly, using their superior mobility to strike from unexpected directions. The Soviet 163rd Division, already short on supplies and suffering from the brutal cold, began to fall apart. Discipline broke down. Units attempted to break out of the Finnish encirclement, but were cut down by Finnish machine gun and rifle fire. On December 28th, the Finns launched a final assault, and the 163rd Division ceased to exist as a fighting force. Some 5,000 Soviet soldiers were killed, and about 1,000 were captured. The rest scattered into the wilderness, where many froze to death. The Finns captured enormous quantities of equipment, artillery, vehicles, small arms, and supplies that the poorly equipped Finnish army desperately needed. But the Battle of Suomussalmi was not over. The Soviet High Command, embarrassed by this defeat, sent reinforcements. The 44th Division, a well-equipped Ukrainian unit with about 17,000 men and extensive artillery and armor support, advanced to relieve what remained of the 163rd Division and to retake Suomussalmi. The 44th Division advanced along the Rajatie Road, a narrow forest track that was the only route through the region. Once again, the Soviets were channeled along a single road with no room to maneuver, and once again, Colonel Sielasvuo's Finnish forces, now reinforced to about 11,000 men, executed a brilliant Moti operation. In early January 1940, the Finns cut the 44th Division into 6 major Moti along the Raiate Road. The Soviet division, despite its superior numbers and firepower, was unable to cope with the Finnish tactics. Communication between units broke down. Supply convoys were ambushed and destroyed. Finnish ski troops infiltrated through the forest, attacking Soviet positions from all sides. The temperature during the battle dropped to -40 degrees Celsius. Soviet soldiers, inadequately clothed and supplied, suffered terribly from the cold. Frostbite was epidemic. Men who took off their gloves to operate weapons found their fingers frozen to metal within seconds. Weapons malfunctioned in the extreme cold. Vehicles wouldn't start. Even before the Finnish attacks, the 44th Division was in desperate condition. The Finnish assault, when it came, was overwhelming. Over several days in early January, Finnish forces systematically destroyed the trapped Soviet units. The fighting was brutal and close range, often hand-to-hand in the darkness and snow. The Raiate Road became a graveyard of men and machines. A long line of destroyed vehicles, abandoned artillery, frozen corpses, and discarded equipment stretching for kilometers through the forest. By January 8th, the battle was over. The 44th Division, like the 163rd before it, had been annihilated. Over 9,000 Soviet soldiers were killed, and about 2,500 were captured. The Finnish casualties were approximately 900 dead. The Finns captured massive quantities of equipment, including 43 tanks, 71 field guns, over 200 machine guns, and thousands of rifles. This captured Soviet equipment would help to re-equip the Finnish army for the battles still to come. The battles of Suomussalmi and Raiate Road had an impact far beyond their immediate military significance. They demonstrated that the Red Army, despite its massive size and modern equipment, was poorly trained, poorly led, and vulnerable to the tactics that the Finns had developed. News of these Finnish victories spread around the world, creating an image of Finnish invincibility that was inspiring but also, ultimately, somewhat misleading. The legend of Simo Heiha and the White Death, among the many stories of Finnish heroism during the Winter War, perhaps none has become more legendary than that of Simo Heiha, the Finnish sniper who became known as the White Death. His story, while extraordinary, also illustrates the nature of the Winter War and the qualities that made Finnish resistance so effective. Simo Heiha was born in 1905 in the municipality of Rautjärvi in southeastern Finland, near the border with Russia. He grew up as a farmer's son, living a simple rural life in the Finnish countryside. Like all Finnish men, he completed his compulsory military service, but there was nothing in his early life that suggested he would become one of the most lethal snipers in military history. Heiha was small in stature, standing only about 5 feet 3 inches tall, and soft-spoken. He enjoyed hunting in the vast forests around his home, and he was known as an excellent shot with a rifle. When the Winter War began, Heiha, now 34 years old, was called up with his reserve unit and assigned to the 6th Company of JR 34, Infantry Regiment 34, defending positions along the Kola River in the Karelian Isthmus. What made Heiha so effective as a sniper was a combination of exceptional marksmanship, intimate knowledge of the terrain, patience, and an almost supernatural ability to remain invisible. He used a standard Finnish M28-30 rifle, a variant of the Soviet Mosin Nagant that had been modified and improved by Finnish gunsmiths. Significantly, Heha used iron sights rather than a telescopic sight. This might seem like a handicap, but it had several advantages. Iron sights were less likely to fog up or reflect light that might give away his position, and they allowed him to keep his head lower, presenting a smaller target. Heha's tactics were simple but devastatingly effective. He would find a good position with clear lines of sight toward Soviet positions, usually concealed in dense brush or behind natural cover. He would create a snow platform for his rifle to minimize disturbance when firing. He would place snow in his mouth to prevent his frozen breath from forming a visible cloud when he exhaled. Then he would wait, sometimes for hours, in temperatures far below freezing, utterly still, watching for targets. When a target presented itself, a Soviet officer, a machine gunner, another sniper, Heha would take a single shot and immediately relocate before Soviet forces could determine his position. He typically operated at relatively short ranges, within 150 meters, where his iron sights were most effective, and where his legendary marksmanship gave him near certainty of a kill with each shot. The Soviets became increasingly frustrated and terrified of Heha. They began calling him the White Death, a name that spread through the Soviet forces facing the Kola River front. The Soviets tried artillery bombardments on suspected sniper positions, sent counter-snipers to hunt him, and even organized special units with the specific mission of killing this one Finnish soldier who had become a symbol of their humiliation. But Heha remained elusive. His small stature, white winter camouflage, and uncanny fieldcraft made him virtually invisible in the snowy landscape. He continued his deadly work day after day, week after week, as the bitter winter wore on. The confirmed number of Heha's kills during the Winter War is astonishing. Finnish military records credit him with 505 confirmed kills with his rifle, achieved in fewer than 100 days of combat. Some sources suggest the actual number may have been higher, as not all kills could be confirmed. In addition to his sniper kills, Heha is credited with over 200 kills with a submachine gun during close-range combat. These numbers, if accurate, would make Heha the most successful sniper in military history. Even if the numbers are inflated, and wartime records are often imprecise, there is no doubt that Heha was extraordinarily effective. His exploits became a source of pride and inspiration for Finnish forces, and a source of fear and demoralization for the Soviets. Heha's career as a sniper came to an abrupt end on March 6, 1940, just a few days before the war ended. He was hit in the jaw by an explosive bullet, possibly from a Soviet counter-sniper, possibly from a random shot in the chaos of battle. The wound was devastating, destroying much of his lower face. His fellow soldiers found him and carried him from the battlefield, not expecting him to survive. But Heha did survive, though he remained in a coma for several days, and his face was permanently disfigured. He regained consciousness on March 13, 1940, the very day the Winter War ended. He would undergo multiple surgeries over the years to reconstruct his jaw and face. Despite his injuries, he lived a long life, returning to farming after the war and living quietly in his home region until his death in 2002 at the age of 96. Heha rarely spoke about his wartime experiences and gave few interviews. When asked how he had become such an effective sniper, he typically gave simple, practical answers. Practice, or I did what I was told to do, as well as I could. This modesty was characteristic of many Finnish Winter War veterans, who saw themselves not as heroes, but as ordinary men who did their duty when their country needed them. Soviet failures and reorganization. By late December 1939 and early January 1940, it had become clear to the Soviet leadership that the invasion of Finland was not going according to plan. What was supposed to have been a quick, easy victory had turned into a quagmire. Soviet casualties were mounting at an alarming rate, and Finnish resistance showed no signs of weakening. Internationally, the Soviet Union was being condemned and humiliated. On December 14, 1939, the League of Nations, the international organization established after World War I to prevent future wars, expelled the Soviet Union for its aggression against Finland. This was one of the very few times the League took such decisive action, and it represented a significant diplomatic defeat for the Soviets. The expulsion was largely symbolic, as the League of Nations had already proven itself ineffective at preventing aggression, but it added to the sense that the world was watching and judging the Soviet Union harshly. Within the Soviet Union, the failures in Finland led to a major reassessment and reorganization of the military effort. Joseph Stalin, though publicly maintaining the fiction that everything was going according to plan, privately recognized that the Red Army's performance had been disastrous. The poor showing of Soviet forces in Finland was due to several factors, many of them stemming from Stalin's own policies. The Great Purge of 1937-1938 had devastated the Soviet officer corps. Stalin, paranoid about potential enemies within the military, had ordered the execution or imprisonment of tens of thousands of experienced officers, including many of the Red Army's most capable commanders. The result was that by 1939, the Red Army was led largely by junior officers who had been rapidly promoted beyond their level of competence. They lacked training, experience, and often the confidence to make independent decisions. Initiative was discouraged, as officers who made mistakes or showed too much independence might be accused of sabotage or disloyalty. The Soviet military doctrine also emphasized mass and firepower over maneuver and tactics. The assumption was that the Red Army, with its vast numerical superiority and modern equipment, could simply overwhelm any opponent through the weight of numbers and materiel. This approach had worked reasonably well against poorly organized opponents in the Russian Civil War and in the occupation of eastern Poland. But it proved inadequate against a determined, well-led enemy fighting on terrain that favored defensive warfare. Soviet intelligence about Finland had been woefully inadequate. The assumption that Finnish workers and peasants would welcome Soviet liberation was based on ideological wishful thinking rather than reality. In fact, Finnish society, while it had class tensions like any society, was fundamentally united in its desire to remain independent. The Finnish Communist Party had little popular support, and attempts to create a puppet government. The Soviets established the Finnish Democratic Republic under Otto Kuusinen, a Finnish communist, immediately after invading, were met with derision by Finns and confusion by international observers. The Soviet forces in Finland were also suffering from severe supply problems. The infrastructure in the border regions was poor, and the Finns had destroyed much of what existed during their retreat. Roads were cratered, bridges were blown up, and railways were sabotaged. Moving supplies forward to the front was a constant struggle. Soviet logistics, never the Red Army's strong point, proved inadequate to the challenge. In January 1940, Stalin made major changes to the command structure and reinforced the forces in Finland. He appointed General Semyon Timoshenko, one of the few senior commanders to have survived the purges, as commander of the Northwestern Front, with overall responsibility for the Finnish campaign. Timoshenko was a capable and experienced officer, a Civil War veteran who had also commanded forces in the occupation of Poland. Timoshenko quickly set about reorganizing Soviet forces. He ordered proper winter equipment to be issued to troops. He insisted on better training, including practice attacks on fortified positions similar to the Mannerheim Line. He improved coordination between infantry, artillery, and armor, He streamlined supply lines and established better logistics systems, and he concentrated overwhelming force on the Karelian Isthmus, where he planned to break through the Mannerheim Line by sheer weight of numbers and firepower. By early February 1940, Timoshenko had assembled a massive force for a renewed offensive. The Soviet forces on the Karelian Isthmus now numbered over 600,000 men, supported by over 3,000 artillery pieces, 2,500 tanks, and 3,000 aircraft. Facing them were approximately 150,000 Finnish troops, exhausted by months of continuous combat, running low on ammunition and equipment, with minimal artillery support and virtually no air cover. The disparity in forces was even more extreme than it had been at the start of the war. The Finns had fought brilliantly, exceeding every expectation, but they were running out of resources and men. Casualties had been heavy, especially among the experienced officers and NCOs who were the backbone of the Finnish defense. Ammunition was critically short, particularly artillery shells. The Finns were firing their artillery pieces sparingly, saving each shell for crucial moments. International support for Finland, while vocal and sympathetic, had not translated into meaningful military assistance. Many countries expressed support for Finland and condemned Soviet aggression, but few were willing to send troops or substantial military aid. Britain and France discussed sending an expeditionary force to aid Finland, but the plans were complicated by the need to cross Norway and Sweden, both of which refused to allow foreign troops to transit their territory and risk being drawn into the war. Some volunteers did reach Finland from various countries, forming the Swedish Volunteer Corps and other units, but their numbers were small, perhaps 12,000 volunteers in total, and they arrived too late to significantly affect the outcome. Military equipment was sent by various countries, but again, the amounts were insufficient, and much of it arrived after the war had ended. The Finns were essentially on their own, and they knew that when the Soviets launched their next major offensive, it would be almost impossible to hold. The February offensive and the breakthrough. On February 1, 1940, the Soviet forces under General Timoshenko launched their massive renewed offensive against the Mannerheim Line. It began, as Soviet attacks typically did, with an artillery bombardment of unprecedented scale and intensity. Over 3,000 artillery pieces pounded Finnish positions for hours on end, firing hundreds of thousands of shells. The bombardment was designed not just to destroy Finnish fortifications, but to overwhelm and demoralize the defenders. After the artillery preparation, waves of Soviet infantry, supported by tanks and continued artillery fire, assaulted Finnish positions across the Karelian Isthmus. The main thrust was aimed at a section of the Mannerheim Line near the village of Suma, where Soviet intelligence had identified the Finnish defenses as being somewhat weaker. The fighting was ferocious. Finnish defenders, emerging from bunkers after the artillery bombardments, poured machine gun and rifle fire into the advancing Soviet infantry. Finnish anti-tank guns and soldiers with Molotov cocktails engaged Soviet tanks at close range. The Finns counterattacked repeatedly, trying to drive the Soviets back from positions they had captured. The winter landscape was transformed into a hellscape of explosions, fire, smoke, and death. For 2 weeks, the battle raged with unrelenting intensity. The Soviets would take a position during the day. The Finns would counterattack and retake it at night. Casualties on both sides mounted rapidly. The Finnish forces were performing miracles of defensive warfare, but they were being ground down by the sheer weight of Soviet attacks. Ammunition was running critically low. Artillery pieces were rationed to just a few shells per day. There were not enough replacement troops to relieve exhausted units or to fill the gaps left by casualties. On February 11th, Soviet forces achieved a breakthrough near Suma. After days of intense fighting, Soviet tanks and infantry managed to penetrate the Finnish defensive line. The Finns attempted to seal the breach with counterattacks, but they no longer had the reserves or the firepower to do so. Once the Soviets had broken through in one sector, they could widen the breach and threaten to roll up the entire Finnish defensive position. General Mannerheim, recognizing that the Mannerheim line could no longer be held, ordered a retreat to a secondary defensive line further back on the Karelian Isthmus. This retreat had to be conducted while under continuous Soviet pressure, a difficult and dangerous operation. The Finns executed it with remarkable skill, fighting delaying actions to slow the Soviet advance while the bulk of the army pulled back to new positions. But the situation was becoming hopeless. The secondary defensive line was weaker than the Mannerheim line and had not been as thoroughly prepared. The Finnish army was exhausted, down to perhaps 60% of its original strength due to casualties. Ammunition stocks were critically depleted. The Soviets, having finally broken through, were pursuing aggressively. Determined to complete the conquest of Finland before the spring, thaw made operations more difficult. In late February, Soviet forces launched amphibious assaults across the ice of the Gulf of Viipuri, attempting to outflank Finnish positions and encircle defending forces. The Finns fought desperately to contain these landings, knowing that if Soviet forces broke through to Viipuri and advanced beyond, the entire Finnish defense would collapse. The Finnish government faced an agonizing decision. They could continue fighting, but military defeat was almost certain, and such a defeat might result in the complete occupation of Finland and the loss of Finnish independence. Or they could seek peace, accepting Soviet territorial demands, but preserving Finland as an independent nation. After intense discussions, the government decided to seek peace negotiations. The Finns were not alone in recognizing that the situation had become untenable. The Soviets, too, had reason to seek an end to the conflict. Although they were winning, the cost had been staggering. Soviet casualties in the Winter War would eventually reach approximately 127,000 dead and 265,000 wounded or missing, nearly 400,000 total casualties. The reputation of the Red Army had been badly damaged. The war had taken much longer and cost far more than anyone in the Soviet leadership had anticipated. Moreover, there were concerns that prolonging the war might lead to British and French intervention, potentially expanding the conflict. The Moscow Peace Treaty peace negotiations began in Moscow in early March 1940. The Finnish delegation, led by Prime Minister Risto Ryti, knew they were negotiating from a position of weakness. They had fought brilliantly, far exceeding what anyone had thought possible, but they had not won. The Red Army was advancing, and Finland could not stop it. The Soviet terms were harsh, but not as extreme as they might have been. The Soviets demanded the cession of the entire Karelian Isthmus, including Viipuri, Finland's second-largest city. They demanded the territory around Lake Ladoga, several islands in the Gulf of Finland, and a naval base lease on the Hanko Peninsula. In total, Finland would lose about 11% of its pre-war territory, including 30% of its economic assets, some 420,000 people, 12% of Finland's population, would have to be evacuated from the ceded territories. The Finnish negotiators tried to improve the terms, but there was little room for maneuver. The alternative to accepting these terms was continued war and almost certain defeat, which might result in even worse terms or the complete loss of Finnish independence. After agonizing deliberations, the Finnish government accepted the Soviet terms. The Moscow Peace Treaty was signed on March 12, 1940, and a ceasefire came into effect on March 13 at 11 a.m. After 105 days, the Winter War was over. The news of the peace terms shocked and devastated the Finnish people. After all the sacrifices, all the heroism, Finland was losing significant territories. The city of Vaipuri, with its medieval castle and rich history, would become Soviet Vyborg. Hundreds of thousands of Finns would have to leave their homes, their farms, the land their families had lived on for generations. But the evacuation of Karelia was conducted with remarkable organization and discipline. Every single Finn in the ceded territories was evacuated to areas that remained part of Finland. Not one Finnish civilian was left behind to live under Soviet rule. This was partly a matter of practical logistics. The Finnish government organized transportation and temporary housing, but it was also a reflection of Finnish determination. The evacuees would become known as the Karelian refugees, and their resettlement and integration into Finnish society would be a major challenge in the years to come. The cost of the Winter War for Finland had been severe. Approximately 25,000 Finnish soldiers had been killed, and about 43,000 had been wounded. This represented about 20% of the Finnish forces engaged. For a nation of less than 4 million people, these casualties were a grievous blow. Almost every Finnish family had lost someone or knew someone who had been killed or wounded. Yet Finland had preserved its independence. This was the crucial fact that would define how Finns remembered and understood the Winter War. They had lost territory. They had suffered greatly, but Finland remained free. The Soviet Union had failed to conquer Finland or to install a puppet government. The Finnish political system remained intact. Finnish culture and identity were preserved, and Finland retained its sovereignty. The Soviet casualties had been far higher. As mentioned, the Soviets suffered approximately 127,000 dead and 265,000 wounded or missing, though some estimates put the true figures even higher. The Soviets also lost enormous quantities of military equipment. Over 3,000 tanks destroyed or captured, over 400 aircraft shot down, and thousands of artillery pieces and vehicles lost. More important than the material losses was the damage to the Red Army's reputation. The poor performance of Soviet forces in Finland was noted by military observers around the world, and particularly in Nazi Germany. Adolf Hitler and his generals, watching the struggle in Finland, concluded that the Red Army was weak, poorly led, and vulnerable. This assessment would contribute to Hitler's decision to invade the Soviet Union in June 1941, with catastrophic consequences for both Germany and the Soviet Union. Life during the war. While we have focused primarily on the military aspects of the Winter War, it is important to understand how the war affected the daily lives of ordinary Finns, both soldiers and civilians. The Winter War was very much a total war, engaging the entire Finnish nation in a common struggle for survival. For Finnish soldiers, life during the Winter War was characterized by extreme hardship, but also by remarkable camaraderie and spirit. The cold was a constant enemy, as dangerous in some ways as the Soviet forces. Temperatures regularly dropped to -30 or -40 degrees Celsius. Soldiers had to be constantly vigilant about frostbite, ensuring that their extremities remained warm and that any wet clothing was dried or replaced quickly. The Finnish soldiers' white winter uniforms were essential for survival. Made from white cotton or linen, they provided camouflage in the snow and, more importantly, were designed to be worn over regular uniforms in layers, creating insulation against the cold. Finnish soldiers also wore fur hats with ear flaps, warm mittens, and felt boots. They had access to warm food when possible, typically a hot soup or stew brought up from field kitchens, and hot drinks like coffee, which the Finns consumed in enormous quantities. The sisu, a Finnish concept that doesn't translate easily into English but encompasses determination, resilience, and courage in the face of adversity, that Finnish soldiers displayed became legendary. Men fought on despite exhaustion, despite cold that made every movement painful, despite seeing friends and comrades killed. They fought because they were defending their homes, their families, their country's right to exist. The Finnish soldiers' relationship with the landscape was profound. These were men who had grown up hunting and fishing in the forests, skiing across frozen lakes, surviving harsh winters. The forests that seemed alien and terrifying to Soviet soldiers from Ukraine or Uzbekistan were home to the Finns. They could navigate by the stars, by the shape of the trees, by instinct. They could survive in conditions that would kill others. This intimate knowledge of and comfort with the environment was a significant Finnish advantage. For Finnish civilians, the war brought its own challenges. The cities, particularly Helsinki, Viipuri, and other urban centers, were subjected to Soviet bombing raids. These raids, while they did not approach the scale and intensity of the strategic bombing campaigns that would characterize World War II, were nonetheless terrifying and destructive. Civilians had to become accustomed to air raid sirens, to rushing to shelters, to the sound of anti-aircraft guns and the crashes of falling bombs. Blackout regulations were strictly enforced to make it harder for Soviet bombers to locate cities at night. Windows were covered with heavy curtains or painted black. Streetlights were turned off. Cars drove without headlights or with heavily shaded lights. In the winter darkness of the far north, this created an eerie, disorienting atmosphere. Food rationing was implemented to ensure fair distribution of scarce resources and to prioritize supplies for the military. Finns were accustomed to a diet heavy in dairy products, bread, fish, and potatoes, but during the war, many of these staples became scarce. People had to adapt, finding substitutes and making do with less. Coffee was one of the hardest sacrifices for Finns, who were among the world's heaviest coffee consumers. When coffee became unavailable, Finns roasted substitutes from barley, chicory, or even dandelion roots. Women played crucial roles during the Winter War. With men at the front, women took over many jobs traditionally done by men, working in factories, farms, and offices. Women also served in military auxiliary roles, as nurses, as members of the Women's Auxiliary Defense Corps, Lotta Svärd, and in civil defense. The Lotta Svärd organization, which had existed since the Civil War era, mobilized over 100,000 women who performed essential support functions, cooking for troops, providing medical care, maintaining communications, and much more. Finnish children experienced the war in various ways. Schools continued to operate when possible, though many school buildings were converted to hospitals or military use. Children participated in collection drives, gathering materials that could be used for the war effort. In the ceded territories, children were evacuated along with their families, a traumatic experience that would mark them for life. Some Finnish children were sent to Sweden for the duration of the war, a controversial program that saved lives but separated families. The international attention that Finland received during the Winter War created a sense of not being alone, of having the sympathy and moral support of the world, even if practical assistance was limited. Finns listened to radio broadcasts from abroad and read newspapers that brought news of international support and condemnation of Soviet aggression. This external support bolstered Finnish morale and reinforced the sense that Finland was fighting not just for itself, but as a representative of small nations everywhere against totalitarian aggression. The phenomenon of winter war kitsch emerged internationally, particularly in the United States and Britain, where Finland's struggle captured the public imagination. Products were marketed as supporting Finland. Songs were written celebrating Finnish bravery. Hollywood considered making films about the war. While this phenomenon sometimes trivialized the very real suffering of the Finnish people, it also reflected genuine admiration and sympathy. Religious faith played an important role for many Finns during the war. Finland is predominantly Lutheran, and the church provided spiritual comfort and a framework for understanding the suffering and sacrifice that the war demanded. Military chaplains served with Finnish forces, conducting services, ministering to the wounded and dying, and providing moral support. The Finns often referred to divine providence in explaining their survival and successes against overwhelming odds. The Continuation War and beyond. The story of the Winter War does not end with the Moscow Peace Treaty of March 1940. The war would have profound consequences for Finland's future, setting in motion a chain of events that would lead to further conflict and ultimately shape Finland's entire 20th century history. The peace that followed the Winter War was an uneasy one. Finland had preserved its independence, but the Soviet Union remained a threatening neighbor, and the territorial losses rankled. The hundreds of thousands of Karelian refugees had to be resettled and integrated into Finnish society, a task that required enormous resources and effort. The Finnish military, while it had performed brilliantly, had been badly damaged and needed to be rebuilt and re-equipped. Finland's geopolitical situation was precarious. The Soviet Union, despite its costly victory, had achieved its strategic objectives of pushing the border away from Leningrad and gaining naval bases. But the Soviets had not achieved their maximum aims of conquering Finland or installing a puppet government, and many in the Soviet leadership remained dissatisfied with the outcome. There was always the possibility of renewed Soviet aggression. At the same time, Nazi Germany, which had stood aside during the Winter War due to its pact with the Soviet Union, was now interested in Finland. Hitler, planning his invasion of the Soviet Union, saw Finland as a potential ally, a country that had every reason to want revenge against the Soviets and that controlled strategic territory on the Soviet Union's northern flank. Finland faced a terrible dilemma. Alignment with Germany was morally repugnant. The Nazis represented everything that democratic Finland opposed. But Germany was the only major power willing to provide Finland with military support against the Soviet Union. Britain and France, which had expressed sympathy during the Winter War, were now at war with Germany and viewed any Finnish cooperation with Germany as hostile. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, Finland was drawn into the conflict. Finnish forces, with German support, launched their own offensive to reclaim the territories lost in the Winter War. This conflict, known in Finland as the Continuation War, would last from 1941 to 1944 and would be even more costly than the Winter War. The Continuation War initially went well for Finland. The territories ceded in the Moscow Peace Treaty were quickly recaptured, and Finnish forces advanced beyond the old borders into Soviet Karelia. But Finland's position as a co-belligerent with Nazi Germany was problematic internationally. The United States and Britain, now allied with the Soviet Union against Germany, viewed Finland with suspicion and eventually hostility. The Continuation War settled into a stalemate from 1942 to 1944, with Finnish forces holding defensive positions while most of the fighting occurred elsewhere. But in the summer of 1944, the Soviet Union, having turned the tide against Germany, launched a massive offensive against Finland. The Finnish army, better prepared and equipped than in 1939-1940, fought stubbornly and eventually stopped the Soviet advance, but at great cost. Finland once again had to seek peace. The Moscow Armistice of September 1944 required Finland to cede territories similar to those lost in 1940, to pay substantial reparations to the Soviet Union, and to drive German forces out of Finnish Lapland, a requirement that led to the Lapland War between Finland and its former co-belligerent Germany. The consequences of the Winter War and the Continuation War defined Finland's Cold War experience. Finland had to navigate a delicate path between East and West, maintaining its independence and democratic system while accommodating Soviet security concerns, a policy that came to be known as Finlandization. The country paid heavy war reparations to the Soviet Union, but these payments, while burdensome, also stimulated Finnish industrial development. The territorial losses from the wars were permanent. The Karelian Isthmus, Viipuri, and the other ceded territories remained part of the Soviet Union throughout the Cold War and became part of Russia after the Soviet Union's collapse. The Finnish-speaking population was completely replaced by Russian-speaking settlers, and much of the cultural heritage was destroyed or allowed to decay. For the Karelian refugees and their descendants, the lost territories remained a source of grief and nostalgia, a homeland they could never return to. Yet despite all the losses and sacrifices, Finns came to view the Winter War with pride. It became a foundational narrative of modern Finnish identity, the story of how a small nation stood up to a superpower and preserved its independence through courage, ingenuity, and determination. The Winter War veterans, including figures like Mannerheim and Heiha, became national heroes. The war was commemorated in monuments, literature, films, and national memory. Military lessons and legacy. The Winter War had significant implications for military thought and practice, both in the immediate term and in the longer perspective of military history. The conflict provided important lessons about winter warfare, defensive operations, the importance of morale and training, and the limitations of material superiority. The Finnish success in winter warfare came from a combination of factors that other militaries studied carefully. The Finns had demonstrated that soldiers adapted to extreme cold could operate effectively even in conditions that would incapacitate or kill soldiers from temperate climates. The importance of proper winter equipment, white camouflage, warm clothing, skis, and equipment designed to function in extreme cold, was driven home. The Modi tactics that the Finns employed so effectively became a case study in how a smaller, more mobile force could defeat a larger, road-bound enemy in forested terrain. The principles: identify the enemy's dependence on roads, cut their columns into isolated segments, attack from the flanks and rear, maintain superior mobility, were applicable in many other contexts and would be studied by military academies around the world. The Winter War also demonstrated the continued importance of infantry and individual soldier skills, even in an era of mechanized warfare. Soviet tanks and artillery, while formidable, had not been decisive against a well-motivated defensive force, fighting in terrain that limited mechanized operations. The Molotov cocktail, a primitive weapon, had proven effective against modern armor when employed by brave, well-trained soldiers. For the Soviet Union, the lessons of the Winter War were painful but important. The poor performance of the Red Army led to major reforms in training, doctrine, and organization. The Soviets improved their winter warfare capabilities, reformed their officer training programs, and gave more authority to field commanders. These reforms would prove crucial when Germany invaded in 1941, and the Red Army had to fight for its very survival. The Winter War's impact on Hitler's decision to invade the Soviet Union cannot be overstated. The spectacle of the mighty Red Army struggling against tiny Finland convinced Hitler and his generals that the Soviet military was weak and could be defeated quickly. This assessment was both correct and catastrophically wrong. The Red Army of early 1940, still reeling from Stalin's purges and poorly prepared for war, was indeed weak. But the Red Army that Germany would face in 1941, and especially in 1942-1945, would be a very different force, hardened by combat, better led, and fighting with desperate determination on its own soil. For Western militaries, the Winter War demonstrated the potential vulnerability of the Soviet Union and also provided a preview of what fighting in winter conditions might require. British, American, and other Western military observers studied the conflict carefully, drawing lessons about cold weather operations that would prove useful in later conflicts. In terms of broader military theory, the Winter War illustrated several timeless principles. It showed that morale and leadership can partially compensate for material inferiority, though not indefinitely. It demonstrated that the defensive can be stronger than the offensive, especially when the defender has good terrain, prepared positions, and is highly motivated. It confirmed that logistics and supply are often as important as combat operations. Soviet supply problems had seriously hampered their efforts. The Winter War also illustrated the limits of doctrine and the importance of adaptation. The Soviet military had entered the war with a rigid doctrine emphasizing mass and frontal assault. When this doctrine proved inadequate, the Soviets had to adapt, eventually developing the tactics and operational methods that would break through the Finnish defenses. The ability to learn from failure and adapt accordingly is crucial in warfare, and the Soviets demonstrated this ability, albeit at terrible cost. Cultural impact and memory. The Winter War has had an enduring impact on Finnish culture and national identity. In the decades since the conflict, it has been commemorated and remembered in numerous ways, from monuments and museums to literature, film, and music. For Finns, the Winter War represents a moment of national unity and achievement against overwhelming odds. In a country that had gained independence only recently and had been torn by civil war, the Winter War provided a unifying narrative, a story of all Finns, regardless of class or political affiliation, coming together to defend their homeland. This narrative has been important in shaping Finnish national identity in the 20th and 21st centuries. The war has been extensively documented in Finnish literature. Veterans wrote memoirs recounting their experiences. Historians produced detailed studies of military operations, political decision-making, and social impact. Novelists and poets found inspiration in the war's dramatic events and human stories. The most famous literary work about the Winter War is probably Väinö Linna's novel The Unknown Soldier, Tuntematon sotilas, which, though technically about the continuation war, captures the experience and spirit of Finnish soldiers during both conflicts. Finnish cinema has repeatedly returned to the Winter War as subject matter. Films range from documentary accounts to dramatic recreations to more impressionistic explorations of the war's human cost. These films have played an important role in transmitting the memory of the war to younger generations who did not experience it directly. Monuments and memorials to the Winter War can be found throughout Finland. The most significant is probably the Mannerheim Line, parts of which have been preserved as historical sites and museums. Visitors can see the bunkers and fortifications where Finnish soldiers fought against Soviet attacks. There are also numerous local memorials commemorating the soldiers from particular towns or regions who fell in the war. The Winter War has also been commemorated internationally, particularly in countries that had sympathy for Finland during the conflict. In the United States, for example, there are Finnish-American communities that maintain the memory of the war and celebrate Finnish resistance to Soviet aggression. The story of Simo Häyhä has gained international fame, with books, articles, and internet discussions celebrating his extraordinary career as a sniper. However, the memory of the Winter War is not without controversy and complexity. The war was immediately followed by the Continuation War, in which Finland fought alongside Nazi Germany. This association with the Nazis, however pragmatic the reasons, has complicated Finland's relationship with its World War II history. Some critics have argued that Finnish commemoration of the Winter War sometimes elides the problematic aspects of the Continuation War. There is also the question of the Karelian refugees and the lost territories. For the refugees and their descendants, Karelia represents a lost homeland, a place of memory and longing. Some have advocated for the return of these territories to Finland, though this has not been Finnish government policy. The relationship between memory of the lost territories and contemporary relations with Russia remains sensitive. In Russia, the Winter War is remembered very differently than in Finland. Soviet historiography portrayed the war as a necessary defensive measure, protecting Leningrad from potential fascist aggression. The poor performance of the Red Army was downplayed or attributed to exceptional Finnish advantages rather than Soviet mistakes. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russian historians began to take a more critical view, acknowledging the failures of Soviet leadership and the high cost of the war. However, the war remains a less prominent part of Russian historical memory than it is of Finnish memory, overshadowed by the much larger and more significant Great Patriotic War, World War II, that followed. Reflections on a remarkable conflict. As we near the end of our long exploration of the Winter War, it is worth pausing to reflect on what made this conflict so remarkable and why it continues to fascinate us more than 80 years after it ended. The Winter War was, at its heart, a profound mismatch. A nation of fewer than 4 million people facing an adversary of nearly 200 million. An army of 300,000 facing an invasion force of 450,000 that would grow to over 1 million. A country with limited industrial capacity facing one of the world's great industrial powers. By any rational calculation, Finland should have been defeated quickly and overwhelmingly. Yet the war lasted 105 days, cost the Soviets dearly, and ended with Finland's independence preserved. This outcome defied expectations and created a narrative of determination triumphing over material superiority that has resonated ever since. The Winter War became proof that courage, skill, and will can matter enormously even when facing apparently insurmountable odds. The war also took place in a landscape and climate that added a unique dimension to the conflict. The image of white-clad Finnish soldiers appearing like ghosts from the frozen forest. The battles fought in temperatures where metal froze and breath turned to ice crystals. The long, dark nights and brief days of the northern winter. All of these created an almost mythical quality to the war. It was fought in a landscape of stark beauty and harsh extremes, and this setting has become inseparable from our understanding of the conflict. The Finnish soldiers' relationship with that landscape was crucial. Unlike the Soviet soldiers, who often came from warmer climates and found the Finnish winter alien and terrifying, the Finns were at home in the cold and snow. They could travel on skis faster than motorized. Columns could move on icy roads. They could survive and fight in temperatures that incapacitated others. They knew every lake, every hill, every forest trail. This intimate relationship with the land they were defending gave them an advantage that could not be measured in divisions or tanks. The Winter War also showcased human extremes, extraordinary courage and resilience, but also tremendous suffering and loss. The Finnish soldiers who fought in desperate conditions, outnumbered and outgunned, defending every meter of territory, displayed remarkable valor. The Soviet soldiers, many of them young conscripts sent to fight in a war they did not understand, in conditions they were unprepared for, suffered terribly. The civilians on both sides who endured bombing, displacement, and loss deserve our compassion and remembrance. From a moral and political perspective, the Winter War presented a clear narrative of aggression and resistance. The Soviet Union, having signed a non-aggression pact with Finland, attacked without provocation based on manufactured pretexts. Finland, a democratic nation that had not threatened anyone, defended its independence. This moral clarity made the conflict easy for international observers to understand, and made Finland a symbol of resistance to totalitarian aggression. Yet we should be careful not to oversimplify. The Soviet security concerns about the proximity of the border to Leningrad were not entirely unreasonable from a strategic perspective, even if they did not justify aggressive war. The Finnish refusal to make any significant territorial concessions during the pre-war negotiations, while understandable, also contributed to the failure of diplomacy. And Finland's subsequent alignment with Nazi Germany, however pragmatic the motivations, complicates the moral narrative. The Winter War reminds us of the unpredictability of armed conflict. The Soviets expected an easy victory and received a costly, humiliating struggle. The Finns expected to be crushed and instead fought to a standstill. The international community expected Finland to disappear as an independent nation, but Finland survived. These surprises remind us that wars rarely go according to plan, that human will and agency matter, and that we should be humble in our predictions about military outcomes. Conclusion. As we come to the end of our journey through the Winter War, let us take a moment to remember what we have explored. We have traveled back to the winter of 1939 to 1940, to the frozen forests and snow-covered landscapes of Finland, where a small nation made its stand against a superpower. We have seen how the war emerged from Finland's complex relationship with Russia, from the geopolitical maneuvering of 1939, from the Soviet desire for security and the Finnish determination to remain independent. We have watched as diplomatic negotiations failed and Soviet forces crossed the border in November 1939, expecting a quick, easy victory. We signs have witnessed the extraordinary Finnish resistance, the defense of the Mannerheim Line, the Moti tactics in the forests of central Finland, the battles of Suomussalmi and Rata Road, the exploits of soldiers like Simo Heiha. We have seen how Finnish soldiers, outnumbered and outgunned, used their knowledge of the terrain, their skill at winter warfare, and their fierce determination to defend their homeland. We have also seen the Soviet perspective, the initial failures, the terrible casualties, the reorganization, and renewed offensive that eventually broke through Finnish defenses. We have understood how both sides suffered, how soldiers on both sides displayed courage and endured hardships, even as we recognize the fundamental injustice of the war's origins. We have explored life during the war, both at the front and on the home front, understanding how the conflict affected ordinary Finns and how the entire nation mobilized for defense. We have traced the diplomatic endgame, the painful decision to seek peace, and the terms of the Moscow Peace Treaty that preserved Finnish independence at the cost of significant territorial losses. And we have considered the war's aftermath and legacy, how it led to the Continuation War, how it influenced World War II, how it shaped Finnish national identity, and how it provided lessons for military thought and practice that remain relevant today. The Winter War was a conflict of profound contrasts. It was fought in the season of darkness and cold, yet it revealed the warmth of human courage and the light of determination. It was a story of terrible losses and suffering, yet also of survival and achievement. It demonstrated both the horror of war and the power of the human spirit to endure and resist. For Finland, the Winter War was a defining moment, a crucible in which the young nation proved its right to exist, its capacity to defend itself, its national unity and purpose. The war came at a terrible cost: thousands dead, territories lost, cities damaged, families torn apart. Yet Finland emerged with its independence intact, its democratic system preserved, its culture and language protected. The memory of the Winter War has remained strong in Finland. Veterans of the war, as long as they lived, were honored and respected. The stories of the war have been passed down through generations. The landscapes where the battles were fought, the forests, the lakes, the remains of fortifications, have become places of pilgrimage and remembrance. For the rest of the world, the Winter War stands as a reminder that size and strength do not guarantee victory, that the will to fight matters as much as the means to fight, that justice is not always on the side of the powerful. It is a story that speaks to the universal human desire for freedom and self-determination, and to the capacity of a united people to overcome seemingly impossible odds. As we close this evening's exploration of the Winter War, perhaps the most important thing to remember is the human dimension of this conflict. Behind the strategic decisions and military operations, behind the statistics of divisions and casualties, were individual human beings. Finnish soldiers freezing in their foxholes, Soviet soldiers dying far from home, children being evacuated from their families, women working to support the war effort, families receiving news of loved ones killed or wounded. The Winter War was not just a political or military event. It was a human tragedy and a human triumph. It showed what people can endure and what they can achieve when everything is at stake. It revealed both the worst and the best of human nature, the aggression and violence that lead to war, but also the courage, sacrifice, and determination that enable survival. Tonight we have walked through those frozen forests, stood in those defensive positions, watched the struggles unfold under the winter sky. We have tried to understand what happened in Finland during those 105 days from November 1939 to March 1940, and why it matters. The story of the Winter War is not just Finnish history. It is a chapter in the larger story of humanity's 20th century, a time of great conflicts and great suffering, but also of remarkable acts of courage and resilience. May we remember those who fought and died in that Winter War so long ago. May we learn from their struggles and their sacrifices. May we appreciate the precious nature of independence and freedom which Finland defended so successfully against such overwhelming odds. And may we never forget that even in the darkest and coldest of times, the human spirit can shine with extraordinary brightness. Thank you for joining me on this long journey through the Winter War. May the memory of this remarkable conflict continue to inspire and instruct us as we face our own challenges, and may we honor the legacy of those who lived through those extraordinary days by working for peace, justice, and understanding in our own time.